Welcome to the Johns Hopkins Women's Health Podcast, A Woman's Journey, Insights That Matter. I'm Kelly Gear-Ripken, and I invite you to listen to Johns Hopkins specialists discuss the latest topics in women's health. Now here's your host, Lily Shockney.
Hi, this is Lily Shockney from A Woman's Journey at Johns Hopkins, and this is our podcast, Healthy Insights That Matter. In this podcast, I'm joined by Johns Hopkins Medicine addiction researcher, Dr. Justin Lee. When we think of caffeine, we usually think about coffee. And according to the National Coffee Association, post-COVID coffee consumption is up by nearly 14% since January of 2021. And 66% of Americans now drink coffee each day, more than any other beverage, including tap water, which is rather surprising. And according to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, 400 milligrams, which is approximately 4 cups of brewed coffee, is a safe amount of caffeine for healthy adults to consume daily. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, known as DSM-5, recognized caffeine use disorder as a condition for further study. That's kind of a blanket comment of we don't know as much as we should know. Maybe one day we'll figure it out. This is why we have decided to discuss the upsides and the downsides of caffeine consumption, and that's why we asked Dr. Lee to join me today. So welcome, Dr. Lee, and thank you so much for being on this podcast with me.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's kick off our conversation with some basic information on caffeine in general. In what forms besides coffee can caffeine be found?
Caffeine is such an interesting drug in that it's perhaps the most widely used and widely accepted psychoactive drug around. Nearly all of us have experience with caffeine in some form. And I think the latest numbers are 89% of US citizens report regular use of caffeine. With that said, and in full disclosure, I have to say that I've had my morning and maybe even my afternoon cup of coffee today, as I do most every day. It's sort of refreshing to talk about a drug, a psychoactive drug, in this manner and being open about it. That said, I constantly contemplate and weigh both the upside and the downside of caffeine use in my own life. I look forward to discussing this and getting into more details with you about this. Aside from coffee, caffeine can be derived from both natural and synthetic sources. So in other words, it can be synthesized in the lab. Common sources of naturally derived caffeine, aside from coffee, include teas, chocolate, guarana, yerba mate, and the choline. And this is just to name a few of the most popular sources. But importantly, caffeine can also be added to many ingestible products, including sodas and energy drinks, diet pills or supplements, and analgesics like Excedrin migraine and other over-the-counter medications. There's also a number of novel products that come onto the market here and there, including caffeinated mints and gum, and even caffeinated vape pens were a thing a few years ago. And I haven't seen too much about them lately, but I'm sure in marketing they'll come and go. One can even find caffeine in topical products like lotions or shampoos and even shaving creams, but these generally are not as widely available as other popular sources of caffeine. But with an internet, you can find caffeine in basically anything.
That's interesting, as I've always associated caffeine with being in something that we would eat or drink. But when you talk about that, it also might be in something that you would be putting on topically that never even crossed my mind. So how is caffeine absorbed and metabolized then?
Caffeine is most widely consumed as a beverage, like you said, sort of like a side market for topical consumption. So I'm really going to focus on absorption and metabolism when caffeine is consumed as a beverage or orally via capsules or powders. Absorption occurs primarily via the gastrointestinal tract, which means your stomach and intestine. Absorption is fairly rapid. So after drinking, absorption occurs within 45 minutes, although there's some data that suggests that absorption might take a bit longer for capsule form versus beverage. And peak blood levels generally occur within the first hour to 2 hours following consumption. So that's absorption. Now, With metabolization, caffeine is metabolized in the liver by the cytochrome P450 enzyme. The half-life of caffeine is about, on average, 5 hours. But interestingly, the half-life can range between an hour and a half to 9.5 hours. What this means is that it takes about 5 hours on average for half of the drug to be eliminated from your body. And then it takes another 5 hours for blood levels to be halved again. Suffice to say that caffeine stays with you for quite a while. Highly important when considering when to consume caffeine relative to when you want to sleep or hope to sleep. I want to drill down a little bit more into the range of caffeine metabolism. I really do think it's fascinating. Whether a person falls more toward the hour and a half mark versus the 9.5 hour value for caffeine half-life depends on a range of individual differences. So metabolism of caffeine and the resulting effects of caffeine, they're not a uniform process. So they can differ based upon both pharmacokinetics, so your metabolism rate, as well as pharmacodynamics, which is the drug receptor density in your brain. And these individual differences are significant as they can drastically change the relationship between caffeine and health and behavior. One more thing, and not to keep belaboring this point, but it's important to note the role of tolerance here as well. Tolerance, in its most simple term, is a decreased response to a drug following repeated administration. I think probably you have some experience with caffeine tolerance. I have some experience with caffeine tolerance. Most caffeine users listening to this discussion probably have an inherent understanding of tolerance as it relates to caffeine use. In essence, the beneficial effects of caffeine decrease over time, thereby necessitating larger, more frequent doses to achieve the same effect.
Which makes sense because that applies to so many other things too.
Absolutely. And this also contributes to withdrawal over time. Important to keep these factors in mind when discussing potential benefits of the drug as well as downsides of caffeine use.
I remember that there was a drug, it was in a little tiny bottle, and I remember seeing it at the checkout when I went into a gas station to pick up something. It was called Jolt. I thought, I got to read what Jolt is. And so I'm reading it and I'm like, well, this is just a caffeine bomb is what this is. And a young man walked up beside me and he said, I rely on these to study for my exams in college. My heart just absolutely sunk because I thought that doesn't sound like a good idea. And now I haven't seen them in the stores. So I'm hoping that means that they pulled them off of the market. But I was really stunned to hear him say this and just be so open about it. I appreciated it because it informed me of something that I didn't know, but I was like, wow, this stuff is just a caffeine bomb for sure. So when we are looking at caffeine consumption, and I understand what you're saying about when does it hit me and how long does it last versus when does it hit you and how long does it last? But coffee isn't coffee, isn't coffee, isn't coffee. Like Starbucks seems to give people the jitters a little more than some other brand. And I've looked at those labels myself before and seen, looks like more caffeine in this than in some of these others. Who determines what is an appropriate amount of caffeine to have in coffee or in another beverage? Is there any regulation of that?
There's really no regulation when it comes to caffeine levels in coffee and teas because it really depends on the brewing process and it depends on so many factors. There's really no regulatory oversight of caffeine levels in coffee or tea.
Can you tell me what the benefits are of caffeine?
Caffeine in and itself doesn't really have a nutritional value, but in this context, it's probably best when we think about the benefits of caffeine to think a little bit more about the pharmacology of caffeine or how it works in the brain. And this, I think, helps provide some context. The direct effect of caffeine works via adenosine receptor antagonism. So what those fancy words mean is adenosine occurs naturally in the central and peripheral nervous systems. And in the brain, adenosine acts as an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It promotes sleep and suppresses arousal. Adenosine levels increase throughout the day. So as you have more waking hours, your adenosine levels are going to increase, making you more tired. And this contributes to fatigue and ultimately promotes sleep. The caffeine molecule, interestingly, is very similar in structure to adenosine. What happens in effect is that caffeine binds to these adenosine receptors, thereby blocking adenosine, which is the main mechanism by which it promotes wakefulness, giving you more energy. But this comes at a cost. There's no such thing as a free lunch, right? So the downside of this relationship is that the brain adapts to these new conditions incredibly well. Over time, the brain produces more adenosine receptors. And of course, this is a main contributing factor to caffeine tolerance. We have to drink more caffeine to stay awake longer. Caffeine also has indirect effects on adrenaline, serotonin, and dopamine function. We talk about caffeine and adenosine as being integral in promoting wakefulness, but these other effects of caffeine contribute to increases in cognitive function. So what are the reasons why we drink caffeine? We want to stay awake. We want to be more focused. We want to have more energy. Caffeine does have benefits, does contribute to increases in cognitive function. There are studies showing improvement in attention, focus, memory retention, and vigilance. And dopamine comes along for the ride and plays a role in the reinforcing or the positive effects of a drug. That's the main benefits that we see in the brain. And aside from the brain, caffeine is a vasodilator. So in the peripheral nervous system, it has anti-inflammatory properties. Caffeine is becoming more and more popular in exercise. There are studies showing that caffeine can increase both aerobic and anaerobic exercise performance. Research especially points to an enhancement in endurance activities, such as running or cycling.
That makes sense.
I ran one marathon and I'll never make that mistake again. Now, I ran a marathon about 10 years ago and I was taking this supplement called Goo and it had some amount of caffeine in it. And I found on days where I didn't take the supplement before my long runs, it was a lot harder. And I don't know if it was a placebo effect, but research generally has demonstrated that there is a real effect of caffeine on these endurance activities. Because of this personal experience, caffeine has become increasingly popular as a pre-workout supplement. Caffeine has long-standing been known as having laxative properties, and it's a diuretic, so it can aid bowel issues such as constipation. And finally, caffeine may also help reduce body fat. We need more research here to better identify the mechanism of action and the duration of this potential benefit in contrast to the development of tolerance. Always comes back to tolerance.
Let me ask you one other question about coffee. Is it true that drinking coffee could help you live longer?
Indeed, there was a recent report from a group in Europe, I think that sparked a lot of interest, that evaluated chronic caffeine consumption as a function of coffee preparation. This would be like instant coffee versus brewed coffee on cardiovascular outcomes and mortality rates or survival rates in a very large sample. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work in sample sizes I think are large, which are like 100 people. This was in a sample of nearly 450,000 participants.
That's a big N, okay.
One of the key outcomes from this study was that mortality and risk of cardiovascular disease was reduced for all coffee subtypes. It includes decaffeinated coffee, as well as ground coffee and instant coffee types. The important thing to underscore here is it was about 2 to 3 cups per day was the sweet spot. There was a purported reduction in risk that declined as the number of cups per day increased past this 5 cups benchmark. I think this has sparked some real interest in the beneficial effects of coffee and caused for us to take an objective look at the beneficial properties of coffee.
At what age would it be considered okay for a child to start having a drink that's got caffeine in it?
This is a really interesting question. And as a father, it hits me at the heart. According to the American Academy of Pediatrics, there's no safe level of caffeine use for children under the age of 13. Caffeine use in teenage kids should be limited to 100 milligrams or less. Higher levels of caffeine can have negative effects on growth and brain development.
How much caffeine would be in a regular cup of coffee or a regular soda?
Soda is a little bit easier to discuss, but let's start with coffee. Discussing caffeine levels is of interest to all of us because we all want to measure our caffeine use, or hopefully at the end of this podcast, you'll have a little bit more of an interest in developing, greater understanding of your daily caffeine use.
I think as a minimum, if they're on Jeopardy and there's a column that says caffeine, they're going to get all the answers right.
Absolutely. Let's hope that that's a future Jeopardy column when I'm on there. So a general guideline, and this is again, general guidelines for coffee, brewed coffee at home is about 95 milligrams per 8-ounce cup. But this can differ substantially based upon the brewing type, the variety of coffee being used, and even the roast type. Data suggests that light roasts tend to have more caffeine than darker roasts, but these differences are exacerbated depending on how much coffee you drink. In contrast, I think you brought up Starbucks a little bit earlier. In contrast to home brewed coffee, coffee from these commercial purveyors, such as Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts, tend to have a higher caffeine content per cup of coffee. So Starbucks has up to 180 milligrams of caffeine if you go to their website. It's actually pretty nice. They really clearly delineate their caffeine content of all of their brews on their website, which is something I feel like is recent. But Starbucks has about 180 milligrams in caffeine for each 8-ounce pour of their blonde roast. And if you look at their Pike Place, which is their medium roast, they have about 155 milligrams. So you can see a little bit of a reduction there per 8 ounce. Important in that 180 milligram blonde roast there for 8 ounces. If you drink a grande, 16 ounces, that puts you at 360 milligrams, which is right at that 400 level. 1 cup of coffee from Starbucks, medium cup of coffee, and you're pretty close to the maximum daily recommended value. Decaffeinated coffee also has caffeine.
A lot of people don't understand that.
Absolutely. So homebrewed decaf coffee has about 3 milligrams per 8-ounce cup. Not insignificant, but this also depends on factors like the type, the method of decaffeination, type of brewing process. And again, this is where a place where commercial purveyors of coffee tend to have higher caffeine content, even in their decaf blends. So again, I went to the Starbucks website, not to pick on Starbucks. I love Starbucks, but their Pike Place roast has about 15 milligrams of caffeine per 16 ounces. It's small compared to caffeinated coffee, but it's absolutely not negligible if you're trying to completely abstain from caffeine. Teas, all of this depends on individual factors like brewing, temperature, lots of things come into play. These are sort of general guidelines for tea, but black tea has about 50 milligrams of caffeine per 6 ounces. Other tea varietals like oolong have a little bit less, about 30 to 40 milligrams. Green tea has about 20 to 30. Of the caffeinated teas, white tea has the least, which is about 15 to 20 milligrams. Sodas are a little bit more easy to discern because generally caffeine content is either listed on the label or it's available on their website. Sodas are also produced in a uniform manner. Pepsi products have about 35 to 40-ish milligrams of caffeine per 12-ounce can. That gives a good reference point to how much caffeine coffee has in comparison to soda.
Let's talk a little bit more about caffeine from the perspective of, can it prevent any diseases and disorders?
This goes back to what we were talking about mortality and survival before. We can start by looking at a condition that has affected me personally, which is migraines. This is one of the sources of how I constantly debate in my own head whether I should be drinking caffeine or not. And I think this is a great condition to discuss the complexities of caffeine as it relates to health conditions. Caffeine has an interesting relationship with migraines. It both acts as a causal factor, which exacerbates the frequency and severity of migraines, but acute caffeine can be a treatment modality for migraine symptoms when paired with analgesics. So it's like, well, what's going on here? Chronic caffeine consumption over time can trigger and exacerbate migraine activity, can cause rebound headaches during withdrawal. The quick Cliff Note version here is that occasional directed use of caffeine does help patients suffering from migraines, but as soon as that occasional directed use becomes chronic consumption, it can flip and become a migraine trigger and make the whole situation worse. It's a little bit like playing with fire. There are synergistic effects of caffeine with other drugs that could be beneficial to underlying health conditions. In addition to the anti-inflammatory properties of caffeine, caffeine also shares synergistic properties with antimicrobials, potentially lowering effective doses of antibiotics. Some data also suggests that caffeine may also synergize with certain antidepressant drugs to enhance antidepressant activity, but there's some caution there that caffeine is also anxiogenic that can exacerbate underlying anxiety. There's some research demonstrating potential effects of caffeine as an adjunct treatment for Parkinson's disease. And there's also some evidence emerging that caffeine has some protective factors against development of Parkinson's disease. So this kind of goes more towards your question of caffeine as a prevention tool. Though, again, there's a complexity involved here with regards to individual metabolism rates, tolerance. So the efficacy of caffeine appears to decrease over time in treating conditions, if there is any signal for treating conditions at all. And as an aid for prevention, one of the keys to be considered is just the amount of caffeine being used per day. It really calls for self-control and moderate use to stay within those guidelines and not succumb to the effects of tolerance and want to consume more and more caffeine, which is very easy to do in this current environment where caffeine is abundantly available.
Are there any dangers in having too much caffeine and doing so on a regular basis of every day? I know people that will drink 12 to 15 cups of coffee a day, and it's not decaf, or 6 or 8 sodas in a day.
First, we can talk about what caffeine toxicity is. Caffeine toxicity occurs upwards of 5 to 10 grams of caffeine. To put this in perspective, what this equates to is over 25 8-ounce cups of Starbucks. But this all has to be consumed at the same time. So risks of caffeine toxicity are real, maybe not so much for coffee drinkers, but for users of highly concentrated caffeine products like powders or maybe even the shots that you were talking about earlier, you might be able to get closer to a toxic caffeine level.
Maybe some of these energy drinks, drinking them a lot.
The more concentrated the caffeine is in the liquid, or if it's powder, the more dangerous it's going to be. But aside from lethal doses, we can talk about caffeine overuse. I think that's a lot more relevant to your question, but I wanted to set the bar high first and sort of talk about, well, this is the worst case scenario. Now let's kind of walk this back and talk about, okay, I just use caffeine irresponsibly. What's that going to look like? Caffeine overdose acutely generally presents as aversive symptomology. You could get chills or flushing, headache, dizziness, nausea and vomiting, heart palpitations and tremors. And again, it's anxiogenic. It can promote basically anxiety or exacerbate underlying anxiety. Now, I want to underscore again that there are vast individual differences in how people respond and they handle caffeine. These are only general guidelines. The other component that we have to weigh with caffeine use is caffeine withdrawal. What happens when you don't get your caffeine fix in a day and you're using 1,000, 1,200 milligrams or more? We can kind of work it back to what you started this podcast on, which are the DSM-5 criteria for caffeine use disorder. And within that, there are criteria from the DSM for caffeine withdrawal symptomology. And this includes headache, marked fatigue or drowsiness, dysphoric mood, depressed mood, or irritability, difficulty concentrating, and in general, there's sort of a nebulous criteria, but flu-like symptoms. So essentially just feeling terrible. The onset of caffeine withdrawal typically begins about 12 hours after caffeine cessation. In effect, when you have your morning cup of coffee, you're already in withdrawal. So you're sort of just catching back up to the previous day's effects.
You're saying, don't talk to me till I've had my coffee.
That's right. And that's a popular phrase in my household. Caffeine withdrawal over time will dissipate, but it peaks between 2 to 9 days. It can last up to 21 days. As a behavioral pharmacologist, I would be remiss to not point out that psychological cues can last much longer. If you're walking down the street and you see your favorite coffee shop, or you smell coffee, the aromas of coffee, they can all bring back and create this strong desire or urge to use caffeine long after someone quits or reduces their use. It's an insidious drug in that respect. It's not a completely bad drug by any means, but it certainly has addictive properties.
Are there some recommendations that you would give our audience? A lot of the people listening to you with me today are women who have teenage children that are drinking a lot of energy drinks. They're involved with sports activities, and they're going to Sam's Club or Costco or wherever and buying it by the case. Are there some recommendations you would give as to how much is too much and when to drink it and when not to?
I'm going to date myself here, but the market for energy drinks didn't exist when I was growing up in the late 80s and early 90s. There was this mythical beverage that kids used to seem to claim to have tried, but never actually had tried, called Jolt Cola. I think this was different than the Jolt you were talking about earlier.
Okay.
Because it was like just another version of cola, but its claim to fame was it had double the caffeine and all the sugar. And Jolt had about 70 milligrams of caffeine per 12 ounces, which was, again, double that of most soda products at the time. Jolt essentially, this was in the mid 80s. It was a bit ahead of its time, as it would seem, because now, as you note, the market is just inundated with these high caffeine content, high energy drinks. Thankfully, caffeine is somewhat of a selling point for these beverages. And so one of the good things here is they clearly label caffeine content right on the label.
So few people read the label.
That's true.
Just read that it says energy or boost your energy. And don't we all want that, right?
Absolutely.
So we all want to have more energy. That sounds like a good thing to do. They call the product by that name.
If I can highlight, it's incumbent upon the consumer at this point. There's a piece of advice. Always read the label before you ingest anything, before you allow your teenagers to ingest anything.
And of course, our teenagers that are in college, we know that about 25% are mixing alcohol with the energy drink. That's an interesting combo.
Yeah, it is. And it certainly has very great amount of risks in mixing caffeine and alcohol. To best discuss this point here, which I think is a really valid one and something we should spend some time on, it's important to acknowledge again that these two substances have a long-standing relationship with one another. So the first thing that pops into my head when thinking about caffeine and alcohol are the movies my dad used to make me watch as a kid, detective movies or westerns or whatever. And the main character would get drunk and someone would brew a pot of black coffee and they would give him the coffee to help sober them up. That's a myth. It's an interesting tidbit of cultural history, but caffeine does not help speed up any process of alcohol elimination. So grabbing a cup of coffee might make you feel more alert, might counteract some of those negative effects of a hangover like fatigue or a headache, but it doesn't do anything to really speed up the sobering up process. So this is important. Go out driving, your blood alcohol content's going to be the same no matter if you drink coffee with it or caffeine with it or not.
That's a really important message because it still remains very common. And I think that movies did influence that of so-and-so has had a lot of alcohol. Let's sober him up before he drives. Let's get him some coffee in him.
Yeah, absolutely. Important myth to dispel. The other risks of combining alcohol with energy drinks, and there's a real reason why the FDA banned caffeinated alcohol drinks. This occurred in 2010. There were these drinks on the market called Four Loko. They were basically energy drinks that were malt beverages. This ban, though, doesn't impact mixed drinks. You can still go to a bar and order a vodka Red Bull and get your caffeine and alcohol the same. But the relationship here, the risks of co-use, lies in the relationship between these two drugs. Alcohol acts as a depressant. Caffeine acts as a stimulant. Consuming caffeine with alcohol can mask some of the depressant effects of alcohol. So you can make one feel more alert, have more energy. It's the same thing we've been talking about this whole time. Importantly here, to underscore is that it makes somebody feel a little bit more sober, more able to do things, more able to drink heavier amounts of alcohol because you feel more awake. These all lead to both acute negative consequences of making bad decisions and risky decisions, and also chronic effects of increased use of both drugs. But again, the main point to underscore is that caffeine does not decrease the absorption or metabolism of alcohol. So your BAC is going to be the same, whether you have 4 vodka shots or vodka tonics or 4 vodka Red Bulls.
We should make that the bonus question on Jeopardy. That's important. Is there anything else that you would like to share with our audience today regarding this really significant subject of caffeine, which I can assure you the majority of people have not thought about until now. And now you're inspiring them to think about it a lot with reading labels and not having elementary school children drinking 2 sodas at the ballpark.
From my time working with caffeine and doing studies, one of the most interesting facets of caffeine is the large individual differences in how people react to caffeine. And I'm sure anybody who talks to other people who use caffeine have the same stories of people that I can drink right before I go to bed and I can sleep through the night. And other people can only drink a small cup of coffee in the morning and are vastly affected by the effects. As a researcher, I'm real fascinated by this relationship because caffeine's so ubiquitous in our culture. Nearly everybody has experience using it. Nearly everybody has opinions on consumption. And there are different cultural and societal norms with use. But one of the things that sticks out to me is our team recently concluded a randomized controlled trial where we were evaluating remote delivery of a caffeine reduction intervention in adults who were interested in reducing or quitting their caffeine use. One of the key takeaways for me was a wide range of daily caffeine use among those interested in receiving the intervention. So we enrolled individuals who consumed as little as 200 milligrams of caffeine per day, all the way up to 1,800 milligrams per day. We see a large range of reported use. These individuals also had to report an issue or a problem associated with caffeine, and most reported anxiety or gastrointestinal issues as being a reason for why they were looking to reduce. These self-reported problems associated with caffeine did not necessarily line up with quantity of use. Take into factor all of the components like tolerance and your overall health and age, because all of these factors can impact the magnitude of the positive and negative effects of caffeine, both acutely and chronically over a large period of time. Now, our research indicated that caffeine users were indeed interested and were pretty successful in reducing their caffeine with guided reduction. So the first step in the process, and I think kind of a good perspective of moving forward and thinking about caffeine, coffee in general, the first step is to be aware and to monitor all of the sources of caffeine and how much of them you use. And then you can take steps to reduce your caffeine use to levels that decrease the negative effects that are associated with the drug, or it'll help you over time eliminate caffeine altogether and minimize the dreaded withdrawal effect, if that is your end goal. But that basic understanding of how much caffeine one ingests over time will be of great value, not only for yourself, but for your primary care doctor or any sort of treating physician, pharmacists who might be prescribing you new medications that might interact with caffeine. Having that understanding and that self-monitoring of caffeine use is very important, just as important as monitoring use of over-the-counter drugs or other recreational drugs such as alcohol.
I cannot tell you how much new information you have taught me today, and I've been in the medical field for 50 years. That's really saying something. What was it that inspired you to want to go into this kind of research?
Ever since I was a graduate student, I really got interested in the co-use of substances because in behavioral pharmacology, a lot of the time we study drugs in a vacuum where we're isolating one drug and ignoring the rest of drugs. I started off in tobacco research and then have moved into cannabis research. But something that is sort of ubiquitous within all of these drugs is caffeine. And so caffeine and alcohol, for example, which we've spoken at length about, is a good example of co-use of these two substances. It just comes from this driving curiosity of what happens when we use this drug, which is so ubiquitous and so acceptable in our society. And caffeine, it has personal interest to me because I use it. So, I want to learn how it affects everybody so I can better benefit my own use. Also, hopefully, we can help progress the field as it relates to our knowledge about use of caffeine.
I'm glad that you're in this research field because I see the benefits that have already been achieved. You're not done yet, as we say, that your research is going to continue, which is wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for your time today and all of your information that you bestowed upon us to pay more attention to caffeine, start reading labels, pay attention to what we're mixing it with or not mixing it with, and be a better informed parent as well. We hope you will join us next month for another educational and information podcast featuring another Johns Hopkins medicine expert. To learn more about important women's health topics, if you live within the vicinity of Baltimore, you're invited to attend A Woman's Journey's next in-person event scheduled for Saturday, November 18th at the Marriott Waterfront Hotel. To receive information about this event and other women's health content, please visit the A Woman's Journey website at hopkinsmedicine.org/A Woman's Journey to sign up for our monthly e-letter, read about upcoming podcasts like this one and other programs, and to sign up for our upcoming free Conversations That Matter webcast. Again, Dr. Lee, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to A Woman's Journey podcast. Join me, Kelly Gear-Ripken, your host, Lily Shockney, and a variety of Johns Hopkins experts on the first Thursday of each month to learn about medical advances in women's health. A Woman's Journey is grateful for the unrestricted educational grants from HRH Foundation that supports our podcast series, Insights That Matter. For more information about A Woman's Journey's virtual programs occurring throughout the year and our monthly webcasts and podcasts, visit our website, hopkinsmedicine.org/A Woman's Journey. Like us on Facebook and Twitter and visit our website at hopkinsmedicine.org/A Woman's Journey. Until next time, stay well.